one for dreamers.
I think Liz should start.
That's how it should begin.
Here's one for every time they jumped without a net.
All right. So how many of you use technology in your everyday lives? How many of you write with technology? How many of you struggle with learning how to write with technology and figure things out, like how to annotate a PDF, or when you're reading a digital textbook, what to do with that? So why are these not things that we want to talk about with our basic writing students? Instilling in them from the very beginning the idea that writing and writing with technology is a skill and a process, just like every other way that we talk about writing. So my second semester of graduate school, I was required to take a course called Teaching Composition, which I took with Pamela Gay, who's one of my big mentors and who I absolutely adore and love. And this was really pretty early on in computers and composition. And she taught the whole thing. I mean, we were still using the computers that had like the green screen, you know, okay. So then I went on to work with Pamela in doing writing across curriculum stuff at Binghamton. I went on to do my work in EOP and was really interested in questions of diversity in the classroom, questions of basic writing and access. And for me, it was really about access and diversity and basic writing from the get-go. That was really where my love and my heart was. So fast forward, I end up at LaGuardia. So I was assigned to teach my courses in a computer lab because they thought I would know what to do with the computers. And I walked into my first semester at LaGuardia and I was in a computer lab for every single solitary class. So I immediately left after the first day of teaching, went home and called Pamela and said, "You are not possibly going to believe the irony of like where I am and what's going on." And so Pamela and I did a lot of back and forth. She really helped me greatly that semester think about all the things I was super passionate about in my career and in my teaching, and then how was that gonna work out in this computer classroom. During that semester, the thing that I really learned that I had not learned at Binghamton was that my students actually didn't know what to do with the computers. And I mean that very sincerely. That was in 2000. Yeah, it was 2000. And they didn't know. They didn't know. They knew how to turn them on. They knew what they were. They certainly didn't have them. Almost none of my students had them. I had a laptop, and I mean, you know, in 2000, laptops were still, you know, like carrying around Shakespeare volume. And I really had to do some thinking about my political desire to make sure that basic writing students had access and what technology meant. And how were my students going to be successful in a world where they didn't know how to use Microsoft Word? Well, they didn't know how to use the internet. Well, they didn't know how, and it just kept going and going and going. It seemed like every year, and then like every 6 months, and then like every 3 months, there were all of these new technologies that were putting pressures on our society writ large and on the classroom and on culture. So fast forward to where I am today, I do think that teaching with technology is an imperative. I think that it is our responsibility, not to teach them everything about technology from beginning to end, but the ways in which technology intersects with our discipline. And it intersects in many, many ways. From this morning in my class, we were having conversations yet again about how to attach a file. I mean, attaching a file to an email is about the simplest thing that you can do. And yet for some, certainly not all, but for some of my students, that's a challenge. How many times are they going to have to perform that simple task at work, at home, right, in their lives? How often are they going to have to do that? And if I'm not going to take the time in the classroom to explain it, where are they going to learn it? Right? I mean, and it impacts their grades in my class. So it's a worthwhile piece of the curriculum. So you have basic writing at that level. But then you have basic writing and technology at the other level, and that is for those of us for whom basic writing is very much a political and social commitment around access. Do we not then also have a responsibility to think about how to shape our curriculum in concert with questions like, what does it mean to write a Facebook profile, and what does it mean that the NSA is mining that data when our students don't even know who the NSA is? Right? Like, how do we help them to become digitally literate? How do we help them to become digitally literate and to be confident citizens who are able to engage in all of the questions of our culture? And I think it has to start with not only how do you write an effective project, not necessarily paper, unless you're writing the Cat W, in which case it does have to be a paper. And how do you use and shape this technology as a user, not be used by that technology. So that's my opening salvo. I'll pass off to you.
Oh my God.
You said you could have gone first.
It's true. I handed it over.
You handed it over. You knew what you were walking into.
So I came to LaGuardia 3 years after Liz did, and I had come from, by way of, I did my PhD at SUNY Stony Brook and had worked with Pat Belanoff, but...
Yay, SUNY.
Yeah,
SUNY represent.
But because I did not, my area of study was not comp ret, but I was very immersed in it. However, getting to LaGuardia was the first time I ever walked into a basic writing classroom and suddenly had to kind of figure out what I wanted to do. Fortunately, I had some comp ret background, and so I felt confident in, I had been doing that for 10 years by the time I got to LaGuardia, but still acknowledging who basic writers are, and this is a really important population, became a really, something that I think has defined who I think of and what I think of myself as. Working with basic writers. As far as technology goes, I mean, even at Stony Brook, we were introduced to, teaching with technology. So I felt like I had some tools and some basic ability. And then coming to LaGuardia, I think it was probably the very first faculty, like welcome to LaGuardia opening fall thing, where the president stands up and talks about how wonderful the college is, and what she presented was eportfolios. And I suddenly saw a way to represent students in ways that went far beyond what their academic record would show. And that seemed really important to me. That was before I stepped into a basic writing classroom. So even before I was working with basic writing students, I still thought, there's so much more to students and we don't, than GPAs, and how do we represent that, especially in a system of students who are socio and economically disadvantaged. How can we represent them? And so I spent 9-10 years working with eportfolios and trying to figure out how they would work for me. And the article I wrote was primarily about that again, failures. There's plenty of failures in there. You try something, you see what works, how this is best going to represent your students. I still find, as Liz was saying, in my classrooms, as I'm sure you all find too, that you have students who are quite savvy, but I still have, one of the things I continue to struggle with, and all my best strategies do not take care of, helping students understand representing themselves for audiences, especially in social media. It's a continual challenge to try to talk to them about how they represent themselves to different audiences, and that's very important. But I agree with Liz that their lives are saturated by it, and we do a disservice if we don't acknowledge that and talk to them kind of about that. And help them to understand, as she put it so well, how to use the technology to not be used by it, right? Because that's something that they're dealing with. And so I got to teach my own lab, and so I said, all right, during that lab, how about we try to do this, students go at their own pace and go through these grammar modules. And it sounded so smart, and it sounded like it might just work. And of course, it was disastrous from beginning to end. Like, I had the representative, he was very kind and very eager, and he came the first couple times to make sure they could kind of all get on and get everything, because again, that isn't a given. And the first day he didn't show up, then there were people who couldn't get on, and somehow couldn't make it work. And even though I would tell them, I am monitoring your progress, I'm seeing, you're taking these pre-tests and you're working the module, they still didn't do the modules. That was really sort of amazing to me. I had this whole really conviction in my mind that teaching grammar outside of a context was a bad idea. But, I got dazzled by the technology for a minute. And so I said, okay. And in the end, they were not any stronger writers because of it. In no way did it improve. I think what would be very nice, and, no publishing company is going to pay for this, but I think we need to do some quantitative tests about this and to kind of look at the progress. What are these really, they sell it as if, English teachers are so happy about this, professors are so happy about these programs. I'd love to see some research, some actual, how does this affect student writing, what are the measurements we're doing, etc. I just haven't seen much on that, and I think we need to study this before we go down that path for certain.
Yeah. Well, and there are questions at the CBW pre-conference workshop at 4Cs this year. One of the panels was on sort of who owns the curriculum. Right, these questions of in what ways, if you buy into a prepackaged program, is the curriculum being flattened, and in what ways is basic writing being defined by publishing companies as grammar? I mean, frankly, many of the technological innovations that are out there are simply a dazzly, sparkly, magical version of the workbooks that students used to fill out that are how to write a sentence, which is not my definition of what basic writing is, and is not really any basic writing teacher I know's definition of basic writing. So there is that also that pressure of technology on the curriculum where, it's easy. And many schools have gone that route because it's really easy to add it on, and it's cheap and it's fast and it's, it's standardized, and it's going to be the same from section to section. I mean, imagine how magical that would be for CUNY, if when you have a writing program and you have 80 sections of basic writing, what the students are studying in every section is exactly the same. Only what is it that they're studying? What is it that they're able to do at the end? What is it that we want them to be able to do? And I think those are questions that we don't talk about. I think there are assumptions about what basic writing is that are being made for us as faculty, and we are not being included in that conversation often. And that is certainly also something around the future of basic writing that concerns me and has nuances with technology that concerns me greatly.
It. But again, to me, it goes to this idea that of creating some kind of work that represents, again, a whole student, not just this one academic moment, this particular class where you're doing this activity, which I understand is what I'm grading. I understand that's my responsibility. However, I feel like, my favorite essays to read are the one where they get to tell me something about them, rather than only, reporting what other people have said, putting together the researched argument, and they feel so much like they can't have a voice there. And the ePortfolio, because it is about them, and they're constantly, I think because they can access their reflective pieces so much more easily, perhaps that's where the reason that it speaks to their voice so much more easily.
I'm just finishing an article on selfies and the relationship of selfies to then ePortfolio. And so in that article, which is not really yet kind of finished, I think there's going to be another revision. I'm kind of grappling with this idea that when we talk about self-representation, there's a lot of discussion in our culture right now with selfies. I'm sure you know that Oxford's word of the year was selfie, in fact, which was so great. They announced that in December as my first draft of the article was due. I was like, yes. So I spent some time talking about the fact that selfies are really kind of interesting because they're the ultimate tool of self-presentation for an audience, right? They're this carefully constructed moment of how do I look, where am I, what am I doing, and what am I conveying to you? And the ePortfolio, for me, is a place where we can really start to break that down because I'm not interested in the carefully constructed moment. I'm interested in how it all goes together. So how does that carefully constructed moment where you look fabulous at your prom or in your wedding dress or whatever, and you take a selfie, connect to the fact that you ended up in basic writing, connect to the fact that you used to be a lawyer in Colombia, and the only reason you're in basic writing is because you've moved to the United States and fell in love, got married, and now this is your life, right? And how does that connect to the fact that 4 years later, you end up at Vassar, right? I mean, it's all connected when you look at the story of a student. And so for me, that question of voice really comes in helping them narrate those connections. It's not in the single assignment, it's in how they make sense of all those different moments from moment to moment to moment, and what that says over time. So really echoing what Heidi said, it's really about the integrative self and that sort of, getting to the question of the gestalt, right? Like, what is it to be whole when you look at your academics and your personal life? And I think that's something that often our students don't have time to think about because they're running from thing to thing to thing, and each academic moment is siloed. But the ePortfolio breaks that open, so students really have to think about, oh, well, I had to study this, but here's what I was interested in, and here's how that connects to this experience. And so we really hear them in a different way than in that faux academic voice that we all know oh so well, because you've written papers in that voice. Some of you are working on dissertations in that voice. Some of you have written dissertations in that voice. And it's important for them to wrestle with that voice. They need to know that voice to be successful in academia. They need to be able to mimic that and do that. But they also need to be able to write and speak in other ways.
Yeah.
And I think it works.
So does that resonate for you as a connection with what Liz just said?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the, a continual question I ask my students is, I try to ask them at least once a week, so just write, in a free write, a focus free write. What did you learn this week? And how do you know you learned it? Like, what does learning really mean? What does this really mean to have learned something? And if you haven't learned anything, why haven't you learned anything? Is there something that's preventing the learning, or did you already know this? This is just a repetitive, or they need to kind of understand what learning is. I feel like I went through most of my college career, and suddenly I was getting a PhD and had never stopped to think about how I had progressed as a writer, as a human being, as just went from place to place to place, and because people kept passing me, thought I was succeeding, and I don't know that I knew what that meant. And I think to force my students to stop and consider just the journey from the beginning of the semester to the end of the semester is not a small thing for them. I think it's really...
Here's one for misfits who broke the rules, who feared the boredom more than scorn or ridicule. You're scared to fly.